So hello everyone and welcome to MCAT. This is a public lecture series that we have usually every exhibition for the year. So I have a pleasure to introduce Alexie Glass this afternoon, who holds two very important positions. In Australia, she's the Executive Director of Artspace Sydney, an interdisciplinary space that supports the production and presentation of contemporary art through exhibitions, performances, artist residencies, and public programs, which she'll be talking about extensively today. And Alexie is also importantly, probably very important for some of the people here, the curator for the Encounter section of Art Basel Hong Kong, the art fair that's coming on next week. A section of the region's biggest art fair that is dedicated to large-scale installations. So she works with international artists across generations to develop collaborative projects throughout Asia Pacific, Europe, and North America. Alexie has also curated for independent spaces, collecting institutions, museums, biennials, and festivals. So thank you very much for coming and gracing MCAT. Also, Alexie is part of our board of advisors. So she's been very good to agree for that.
Thank you, Josephine. While you were introducing me, but I suddenly realized I should ask my colleague to manage the slide.
It's just before Alexie begins, we'd like to welcome Marianne Casara.
Thank you. And thank you so much for being here this afternoon. I think even a bespoke group is a great group. And I always try to approach these programs in a way where I want to be as honest and candid as I can, to tell you things that you couldn't find out by Googling on the internet, and to speak frankly about not only the things that work well, but also the things that are challenging. So, I do appreciate that these sorts of conversations can become robust. If there's anything you want to ask or interrupt me at any time, then please feel welcome to do so. And I would just like to begin by saying thank you to Joselina and to Chris for having me here at MCAD. I've known Joselina for about 10 years, and she is one of my favorite curators in the region, and such a tremendous leader and advocate and passionate and committed, dedicated, invigilator and speaker and agitator and producer and creator of opportunities for artists' works, and such a really great representative for the region on a number of stages, from when she worked on the Singapore Biennial so many years ago, which was a remarkable exhibition, through to her leadership at MCAD. And I was absolutely delighted to be invited to join the advisory board of the organization and to be part of working with MCAD in how they shape and articulate a vision, because I share a lot of concerns and interests and challenges with MCAD through my own leadership at Artspace and through what I try to achieve. And I will introduce my Deputy Director, Michelle Newton, who is here with me today as well, and fulfills a really important collaborative role in leading the organization. And I suppose, when I was asked to give this talk today, I come to the Philippines to participate in board meetings with MCAD and to be part of discussions. And I was asked to do this talk to speak about some of the challenges that face organizations in articulating and creating spaces to engage audiences, and how you match the ambitions and aspirations of an institution with the realities of resourcing and the limitations of capacity. And I wanted to begin with this slide by Pablo Helguero, not only because he's hilarious, but because I think it's always good to begin by knowing that nobody's place in the art world is ever secure, stagnant, or frozen in time, and that we're all constantly shape-shifting and responding. And for me, if you want to work with contemporary art and living artists, and you want to work with the artists and ideas of our times, then you must take on board the fact that everything is constantly changing. There's no such thing as sustainability, because in a sense that suggests an endpoint. There is a capacity and necessity that you have to build in artistic communities for resilience. And resilience is about being able to be agile and responsive to shifts and currents and moves in the social, cultural, and political climate in order to be able to support ambitious, risk-taking, and critical programming. So how do we do that? So, I am who, I don't know how many of you will have been, I imagine a number of you will have been to Sydney, Australia before, was that some of you pressing a button to say you'd been there? But You know, Artspace, I've been very fortunate over the 20 years of my career to work in a mixture of museums, biennials, art fairs, but largely not-for-profits. And for the past 12 years, I've been in a directorial capacity, working for Kunsthaler and not-for-profit spaces in the region, advocating for an idea of what it is that art can be and what art can become. And I really love working, I have worked in large museums, but I really love working at the interface of not-for-profits like Artspace, because there is a direct engagement with artists and audiences that you can't really get when you work in larger institutions. There's this kind of immediacy of dialogue that exists. Artspace is a 35-year-old government-funded not-for-profit located on Sydney Harbour in Sydney. We're about 8 minutes walk from the Opera House, and we're in a 3-story building called the Gunnery. The Gunnery was built in the 1800s by the British across the road from a naval base as a storehouse for munitions, for explosives, and it was actually a testing building, the Gunnery, for explosives. In the 20th century, it became a storage facility for Fairfax Press, and then in the 1980s, it became a squat for alternative subcultural and, independent communities to come and live in self-organized groups. It was anarchic, sexy, and punk. And then in the 1990s, the building had a level of investment by the founder of the Biennale of Sydney, a man called Franco Beljononetis, who committed a sum of money to government to secure the building as a facility for contemporary art. So we have this remarkable location. We're at the back door of the State Gallery, the Art Gallery of New South Wales. We're 8 minutes walk from the iconic Opera House. We're across the road from the most famous pie truck in Australia. And our front yard is one of the richest pieces of real estate in the city, where superstars like Russell Crowe live, and our backyard is actually one of the last pockets of social housing in the inner city of our city, which is dedicated to communities that experience social and economic disadvantage. And there's actually a huge interracial and Indigenous community that live at our back door. So we operate at this really interesting interstitial space with a history of explosives, which I think are important ideas, archives, alternative communities, and a commitment to contemporary art and the art of our times. On the ground floor of the building is our galleries. The middle floor at the moment we're about to take over to create a multi-platform education, outreach and expanded production space, which has been part of a vision we've been working on for 5 years. And our top floor is 11 studios. When I came on board as Director of Artspace, if we could go down a slide, yeah. When I came on board as Director of Artspace, it was 5 years ago. I'd actually worked at the organisation. I grew up in and out of Sydney, and I'd gone to university in Sydney in the 1990s, and I'd actually worked briefly at Artspace as front of house. And it was great to come back to an organisation that I'd worked at. I'd moved away from Sydney as a young curator to work at the Australian Centre for the Moving Image as a curator focused on the expanded space of media and digital work within the Asia Pacific primarily, which is when I began working much more extensively across Asia. I lived in Korea for a period where I worked at Sanji Space with Kim Hong-hee, and I came back to Melbourne to take up the directorship of Gertrude Contemporary. And I then came back to Sydney after 12 years away, and my first meeting with state government, who is our primary funder, they said to myself and Michelle, Artspace has lost relevance, you're important, but we don't know what you're doing and we don't know why you're doing it. And if you don't actually think about what your organisation represents in a changing landscape, then the 30-year history of your organisation is going to become moribund, and we will put you on notice for your funding. So that was pretty bracing. I'd been back in Sydney 2 weeks and I was like, yay. And when your primary funder says, that we're not actually sure who you are, we know you're important, but what do you do? And what was really important, and I'm going to tell you this because I think it's important when you think about what MCAT is, when you think about what institutions are in the Philippines. It's a different structure here, but I think across the region we've seen a vast acceleration in the past 20 years of the expectation and capacity of what it is that contemporary and alternative art spaces do, and how they generate and create space for the creation of new work, and how we invest back in audiences and artistic communities equally. And what was interesting for Artspace, we returned to look at our original founding origins, and we thought about the organisation. What we thought was that we needed to ask some questions. Actually, maybe if we go, if we can just go down 2 slides for a moment. What we decided to do was convene a 5-day planning meeting with my board and staff in 2014, and I asked the question, should Artspace exist? And I asked that question legitimately. I just started as director. Some people said if I was convening this meeting, it was because I had no idea how to lead the organisation and I had no ideas of my own. But I had plenty of ideas. But I think ethical leadership in a curatorial space if you take seriously practice, which demands a level of social accountability and ethical practice, then you have to actually be prepared to ask hard questions. Is my organization done? Has it exhausted its capacity? Is it actually just becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy that congratulates itself for existing? Or is it contributing something meaningful to the landscape? My fantastic colleague Michelle had been at Artspace a year before I began, and she'd done an audience survey. She found that 48% of our audience was aged 35 to 49. She found that over 70% of our audience came from 5 suburbs in Sydney. A huge audience came online, but there was no programming online. We had an aging audience, we had a limited demographic, we had no Indigenous respondents, and very few international or people who identified as culturally diverse. And in Australia in the 21st century, that's just not good enough. We found that we had 9,000 people coming through our doors in a year, and as a curator, I don't think you change audiences by curating shows. I think you change what organizations do by changing the culture of what the organization is back of house. And you look at what artists talk about in terms of what practice means, and you think about that. You have to think about financial sustainability. You have to think about workplace environment. You have to think about employment agreements for staff. You have to think about human resources. You have to think about who is your board and who are your management and what are your governance and operational structures. And who are you accountable to and why? So we got out a paper that had been written by Vasif Kortan, who founded a really fantastic not-for-profit in Turkey called SALTS. And he'd written a paper that said, how long should an institution last? Should not-for-profits be like the British model, where if you build it, it lasts forever because colonial empires prove nothing if they don't last in perpetuity? Or are you like corporations pre.com, like Kodak, 60 years was the average life of a company? So we asked the question, should Artspace exist? And if Artspace exists, who does it exist for and why? And I think if we go back up to just back one slide, what we decided to do in that 5-day meeting with board and staff was we changed our mission and vision. And we changed our mission to be ever-changing, ever-challenging. Artspace is a place where audiences and artists meet the artists and ideas of our times. I think I got it almost right. But it's really important. Ever-changing, ever-challenging for us was about saying, you know what? We never have enough money, we never have enough resources, but we have to operate at a level of best practice. We have to demonstrate leadership. We have to demonstrate courage. And to do that, we have to be able to be responsive. We have to understand that things change. We have to be ever-changing, ever-challenging in our program, in our operations, in our administration, in our individual roles, and we need to take nothing for granted. And that was a really big catalyst shift for the organization. Also, audiences had never appeared in our mission and vision statement. And one of my board directors said, Artspace doesn't do audiences. We support artists. If we make one artist happy, we've done our job. And I was like, no, you actually haven't done your job. You receive public funding, you receive philanthropic and private funding, we receive grants, we have a responsibility to the community to be good citizens and to contribute more than just supporting one artist. And if we don't bring audiences to artists, then we have not done our job. Who are we doing it for? You know, so we were like, no, that is absolutely not the culture of the organization anymore. So this was a really important change, and language is important. That's what we know from contemporary art. Language, the vocabulary and the words that we use and the words that we share are how we determine the parameters and scope through which we can actually embrace risk. And so we have to introduce in our organizations language that we believe in so that we can share that language with our audience and we know who we are when we speak to them. So what we did was we decided to, if you can move down a few slides to the one that says organizational sustainability, we decided to move the organization away from monographic exhibition making as the primary mode of production. And that's a complicated sentence, but what I mean by that sentence is the organization, I'm a curator, I love to curate. I love to curate a show about bottled water and choose bottled water artists and write a bottled water catalogue and congratulate myself for my amazing insights into bottled water. But you know, that's only one model of curating. And that does not sustain an organization. And using the organization's resources to pay for curatorial vanity projects at the expense of investing in an expanded program of responsive support and investment in the development of practice across a range of forms is not actually working for contemporary art. So what we decided to do was to think about, if we can go down actually to Artspace Studios. On our top floor of our building, I showed you that we had 11 studios. And those 11 studios were user pay up until 5 years ago. And we used to generate about $100,000 a year in revenue. It was prestigious to have a studio at Artspace because you had to apply, but we had to fill a certain quota in order to meet that $100,000 a year. And if an artist didn't pay their rent, they became a debitor to the organisation. So we had to chase them for money. So what Michelle and I bid to the board in that 5 days of Should Artspace Exist was we said we need to shift how we think about this organisation and who it's accountable to. And what we want to do is make our studios free. We have 7 non-residential studios and 4 residential. We wanted to make our 7 non-residential studios free for 1-year residencies for Australian artists tied to curatorial advocacy. So what we mean by that is we have these huge studios. If you go down 2 slides, you can see an image of one of our studios. What we wanted to do with those studios was we said to the board, we're raising $100,000 a year just off the 7 non-residential studios. We said to them, we want to support a 10-year program to support 70 artists and collaborations with 1-year residencies at Artspace, which is $1 million of investment back in artistic practice. And we said we want to fundraise to pay for that through philanthropy and benefaction, because we believe that there's a philanthropic community in Australia who are not being tapped, who want to support new work by artists, and by supporting substantial real estate in the centre of the city where artists can develop ambitious new works with 24-hour access, and to support 70 artists over 10 years with $1 million of investment is actually a really great thing to do, and it benchmarks that the organisation takes artistic production seriously, not just exhibitions, and that we don't just support the front end, we support the back end. And what was great out of that 5 days was that the board said yes. And they said, you have to go raise the money. It was great they said yes, but it was terrifying. It was like a black hole beneath us. We hadn't raised that kind of money previously, but we knew that we had to diversify income and revenue in order to demonstrate to government that our organisation was going to be viable to receive continued government funding. There is a demand in Australia from government that you must generate your own income now. And on average, we've increased our self-generated revenue from 4 to 38% of our annual turnover, which puts us on par with performing arts. We created a funding program called the Future Fund for Living Artists, and we have benefactors commit to supporting the studios. We brought on board the University of New South Wales, which is a preeminent university in our state and in Australia, and the art school is 15 minutes walk away from Artspace. And they committed to make every artist and curator in residence at Artspace a visiting fellow at the university with full access to all production and research facilities. So artists in our 1-year program have access to kilns, to woodworking, to technology, to editing, which is a fantastic and unprecedented partnership, and we were able to demonstrate leadership through that partnerships. Partnerships are really key for us in achieving outcomes for artists. We also made our 4 residential studios free, and we made them free for residencies of 2 weeks to 3 months, and we made them free for artists and curators. We can't fund international artists to come to Australia, their airfares or per diems, but if an artist approaches us, we can give them free accommodation. And our studios are worth $600 a week, so if we can give an artist a studio for 4 weeks, that's $2,500 we've been able to invest in your program. And one of the words we use in our vocabulary is generosity. That Artspace, as a Kunsthaler who believes in the principles of contemporary art in the 21st century, has a responsibility to be generous. And we have a responsibility to not just invest in our own program, but to invest in the programs of others, because everyone in a community is always suffering an absence of resources, and accommodation is a way that we can invest in other people. And with our residential studios, we didn't create a deadline for applications. There's a very strict process for our 1-year residencies, but not for those. So that was a really important shift for us. A number of other shifts was that if you can just go down 2 slides to education and community, was that we began a partnership with the State Gallery, where for the first time in our history we're working with the community in our backyard in Woolloomooloo and doing a series of programs where we work regularly to show up at community meetings. We invite kids into the building. Every month we invite the community in to have their family, to have their meetings with all the different groups that feed and resource the social housing community in our neighbourhood, and we partner to bring artists in to do education and workshops with people who suffer from mental health, disability and economic access issues. And we try to let the community lead those projects. We try not to turn up and say, here's what we want to do. We just try to say, we have a space, we can work with you. So I think that was really important for us, because something that was really key was that we created downstairs in our galleries. If we go down quite far, can you go down to, at our entrance of our building, we had a space that was a room. And I want to go to the Ideas platform, if you could just flick through, Mish. Go down a couple more to the Ideas platform. We had a room, and this room was previously a storeroom for the Biennale of Sydney. And we realised in our galleries, we only have the money to do 4 or 5 shows a year. In any 2-year cycle, Artspace has sort of 10 shows. 2 of them are a fellowship that we're committed to present with the government that's existed for 100 years. 2 of them have to be solo exhibitions of Australian artists. One of them is the Biennale of Sydney, which we've been a partner for since 1993, and one of them is a book fair. That leaves us with 4 curated shows. With 4 curated shows in 2 years, how can we actually service every artist in our community? And how can we represent Australian and international art in conversation? And how can we be relevant? So we decided to create a project space. And our project space was a room, and it was really simple. We called it the Ideas Platform, and it's as simple as if you have an idea, we have a platform, and we made it a short turnaround of 2 to 3 week shows. We got a private benefactor on board to give us enough money to resource that space, and we have 12 to 15 shows a year in there that support artist projects in production, in process. A range of things from sound, moving image, installation, it can be anything. If you have an idea, we have a platform. So we're always trying to think about how can the institution be curated? How can we be operating? We think about what we call it is a multi-speed approach. We don't just think about what's the next exhibition, what's the next exhibition, what's the next exhibition. We think what's happening in the studios, what's happening with visiting curators, what's happening with research, what's happening in the Ideas Platform. And as curatorial, as management students, arts management students, when you go to work for organizations, when you lead organizations, ask yourself the question about how can I operate at different speeds? How can I engage different stakeholders in different communities in different ways? In terms of our exhibition program, if we go back up, actually I might grab this. Because I'm going to move too quickly, otherwise I think if I'm going to go back that way, I'm going to go back through the nudes. We have to think about Australia's role in the region, and we have to think about who we are and where we're identified. And something that's really important for Artspace is we say Australian art is international art. And by that we mean that the artists, the ideas that artists in our community are working with are not singular to Australia. They have a unique dissonance and range and register because of the context from which they come, but they are not exclusive or apart from a global conversation. And I think something that's been really important that's happened in relationship to the region over the past 25 years, 10, 15 years ago, there was this rhetoric that the edges were going to come to the center and the center would come to the edges and we'd all become a global village. But actually what happened was that we realized that every edge and every center has its own depth, that the periphery has its own context, its own histories, its own viability, its own efficacy, that it's absolute bullshit to think that you can know everything and be everywhere. And actually you have to recognize that the Philippines has a dynamic and incredibly rich history, and that rich history is distinctive from Thailand, it is distinctive from Johannesburg, it is distinctive from Colombia, and it is distinctive from Brisbane. But these things have importance and agency, and again, if you take practice seriously, you have to recognize the relevance of the context from which you produce and make work and how that can exist in a viable conversation with others elsewhere. You don't want to create an echo chamber where you're just showing local artists in conversation with themselves, but you also don't want to create a helicopter situation where you bring international product in and drop it in meaninglessly in a way that it has no relevance for the audience here, in a sense creating a kind of binary. So how do you actually think about meaningful ways to engage? So what we try to do is we try to think about an expanded artistic program in our galleries. So like I said before, we have our fellowship show which supports local artists. We have the Biennale of Sydney which does something else. What we decided to do with our 4 exhibitions a year is we try to think about how we can engage. As a curator, something that I think is really important is that I don't curate to taste. In any institution that I'm leading, there are things in the program that I don't necessarily think that I'm going to like, but I have to believe that they are important. And I don't think when you lead organisations in the arts that receive public or private funding that you can curate or produce programs that operate to your taste. I think you have a responsibility to be expansive and generous and learn from art, and to program things that you believe will challenge you to expand your own vocabulary. And I've learned more in 20 years from working with things that I thought I wasn't going to like than by curating shows with things I thought I really liked. And that's really exciting because then I can share that with audiences in different ways and bring different people in and bring different kinds of work into the organisation. And I also want with my organisation and with my team, and I work with my team very closely, I don't ever program anything at Artspace until the team have ratified it. I work closely with Michelle to make sure every element of financial and operational sustainability is aligned with artistic vision and programming. It's not just up to me to go, we're going to do this. It's up to the team to decide that this is something we believe is relevant for communities, and who are we thinking about? We actually did a lot of constitutional reform at Artspace, and we've changed our board to have a set of principles that now say that we must always have full gender parity on our board, we must have cultural diversity, and we must also have an Indigenous board director. And we are one of the few arts organisations in Australia that has an Aboriginal board director, and that is an artist called Daniel Boyd. And in our program, we have determined that we want to have at least 50% gender representation at all times. We want to make sure that we have cultural and linguistic diversity and Indigenous and First Nations representation up to about 20 to 30% of our program annually at a minimum. We try to think about how we can support different communities in different ways with the resources they need. And something that we did do, which I did enjoy doing, this is us curating. I'm like a bit of an old school curator. I do a bit of cutout and collage. So I just thought I'd include that because it's hilarious. But you know, there are certain things in an organisation like Artspace that are challenging back of house. One thing we have is that government 10 years ago had a situation where an artist in Australia called Bill Henson was charged in the public domain, never in court, with taking photographs of young people in sexually provocative poses that charged a kind of challenge to a social convention around notions of sexual identification and the possibility of the infantilization or sexualization of children. He's never been charged, and his work is borderline, in my opinion. But what was important about this case 10 years ago was that our government at the time legislated that any organisation that receives public funding, if they get charged with obscenity, indecency, or pornography, their funding is suspended until allegations are disproved. So what this means is that indecency laws in Australia the policy as it relates to indecency in an organisation like Artspace is ostensibly more extreme than it was in the 1970s. And that we have a situation where what we do is we self-censor, right? And you live in a complicated political climate like we do. And so what do? Do you provoke for the sake of provoking, or do you think in a different way about how you can agitate and expand a space for a vocabulary of what is socially acceptable? I think art has a responsibility to push at the edges of social norms in order to provide space for LGBTQI, for racially diverse, for feminist communities, for people who exist in different frames and regions within the kinds of within the definition of social norms, to create room at the edges, to make social change, to recognize that racial diversity, to recognize that feminism, to recognize that sexuality is the choice we get to make. So how do we push at that when we're afraid that if we show a work that offends someone, we might lose our funding? So do we curate for the one person who we're afraid might go to the police and say Artspace is showing pornography? And 5 years ago, an artist was charged with showing pornography in an exhibition in Melbourne, and he was taken to court. And that was a local council-supported space, so they were not funded under the same structure that we were. But it's an interesting challenge. So what we decided to do was curate a show called The Public Body, a 3-part show over 3 years, looking at one idea through 3 iterations. And that was looking at the LGBTQI, racial and post-sexualization of the body in the 21st century. We showed works in this show that we knew had been censored in Australia. The first edition of the show included 17 artists from 12 countries, and there was 5 works that we knew deliberately sat in a space that was going to be a challenge for us to show. And one of these works is the work that's up on the screen, Community Action Centre by A.K. Burns and A.L. Steiner, who are 2 LGBTQI and trans artists working out of LA and New York. Really important artists who've been in shows at LACMA, the New Museum, the Tate. But in Australia, precedent is no defence for a work of art. In Australia, in the visual arts, any work in film, any moving image work has to go through classification. This is a moving image work showing non-normative bodies engaged in consensual subcultural sexual activities. It shows pretty explicit sadomasochism, bondage, and consensual exchanges between people who identify as having physical disabilities, and in very kind of explicit ways. But what it does is it says that there's no such thing as normal sex. There's no such thing. If you have consent, then what you choose to do with your body, with a partner in a space that is consenting, says something about the space in which art exists. and something about the language with which we apply to a sex-positive understanding of who we are, rather than a shaming language around sexuality and how we think about what a normal body is or a non-normative body. So it was really important to us that we show this work. But this work had been rejected for classification in Australia with an underground film festival. So we knew that we were breaking the law by showing it. So what we did was we worked to do a 5-page risk management plan, which is huge amounts of fun. And we consulted with 2 sets of lawyers. We consulted with arts management organisations, and we submitted to our board in a standalone meeting a presentation of the show to get ratification to go ahead with the exhibition, knowing that if anyone charged us with showing pornography, that we would have our funding suspended. Our organisation is only allowed to have 3 months of reserve in the bank, according to government, to match with our funding. We're meant to spend the money we receive. So that means we have about enough money to pay our staff for 3 months. So if something goes to court, what does that mean? Do we really want to put the organisation at risk over showing some light bondage? And the answer for us was yes, because we think that the role of art is to expand the language and the space of who we are and what we can become, and that being sex positive and that speaking about our bodies in all their expanded glory is a really important role and function of contemporary art. When you think about the role that HIV activists played in the 1980s with creating space for the recognition of LGBT communities, when you think about the role that feminist artistic practices played in the 1970s with moving image, the role of the Sony Portapak with artists like Carolee Schneemann and what they did to spread the word about what it was that feminist agency could look like. You know, this is important. You have to take these risks. So we did the show. What we decided to do was we couldn't make the show over 18 because that would admit to the police that we knew we were breaking the law. So we briefed our staff to ask consent of every viewer who came into the show. And it was a really good show for us. No one complained, which was great because also, you know, I don't want to trigger people. And we understand that people suffer things like sexual abuse and violence and trauma. And as an organisation, we also don't want to be responsible for triggering people's histories of trauma. But we also have to recognise that up at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, they have permission to show history paintings that depict things like rape by artists like Ongres. They can depict bestiality with Leda having sex with the swan. They can depict a history of violence against Indigenous people through colonial painting and the unattributed robbing of artefacts from communities. So we want to present what we do ethically, and we want to think about it responsibly in collaboration with our audience. And that's been a big shift for our organisation, is that we don't think of the audience as learning from Artspace. We think about the audience as deciding what our exhibitions mean. We can give them every possibility through texts, through curation, through how we iterate the space. We make sure that our front of house staff are always well versed in the exhibitions that we have on and why. And then they can work with the audience to collaboratively come together to shape a space and language over what it is that people are seeing and how they think about it. And I think that's really important as people as future, you know, you guys are future arts leaders in the sector in the Philippines and elsewhere. And you need to think about all the different kinds of communities, not just at the big end town, but you need to think about different kinds of communities and how they can collaborate with you to create meaning out of what it is you do, not you telling them what it is they do. So a show like that was quite important for us. But then we think, and these are images of the subsequent editions. Doing a painting show, we try to think in the expanded field, but I want to take you to a show, I want to take you through 2 more projects before we finish up. I want to take you to this show. And this was a really important show for us, 52 artists, 52 actions. When I said to you before that Artspace found that we had a huge audience who came to us through online because they never come to Australia, because Australia is the last stop at the end of the world before Antarctica, you know, we realised that what we were doing was we were missing a space in which we could curate meaningfully. And I'm passionate about Asia. I grew up at a time where Australia was thinking about its relationship to the region, about being a part of a citizen in the region. I believe Australia should be a republic. I think it's time we cut the apron strings with England. I think it's time Australia stopped thinking of itself as the 53rd state of America and, you know, cut its ties. A huge number, for the first time in our history, the population of Australia, in terms of new arrivals, is no longer European. It's actually Indian, Bangladeshi, Pakistani. Australia's population is actually 70% culturally diverse. Cultural diversity now outweighs Anglo-Saxon heritage in Australia. We have to think about what that means. And for me, my Asia is Turkey to Guam. And that's a really expanded Asia, but that's the Asia I live in. I live in an Asia that tracks West Asia, down through parts of Kazakhstan, down through Afghanistan, down through South Asia, down through the subcontinent, down through Burma, down through Myanmar, down through the Philippines, through across the Pacific and into the Cook Islands, and up right into the edges of the Pacific. That's the Asia I know. And with 52 artists, 52 actions, we wanted to curate a program where we could commission an artist a week to enact a socially engaged or political action in their local community. And we partnered with Instagram out of New York. We found out that Instagram has a director of visual arts. Fucking great job. And and what we did was we thought, Instagram is an amazing way that you can work with the primacy of visual content. I studied photography. I love Instagram. I'm a total whore for it. And I love photographs. I love images. And so what we wanted to do was create and curate in a different way in the online space to think about socially engaged and political content and how we could commission new work by artists, but reach new audiences and not have to just ship work, not be thinking about containers or crates, but be thinking about how we could enable people to own their own voice and language. So every week for a year, we commissioned an artist a week to take over our Instagram account, 52 artists, 52 actions. We had to fundraise from zero for this project, and we did a Kickstarter where we actually asked people to fund for $500 an artist commission. And for every $500, we paid that. We didn't want to do this project if we couldn't pay artists. And $500 for an artist fee is good for a week of an action, and $500 goes a long way in various contexts. And it was really important to us that we don't do any project unless we know we can remunerate artists. Artists should not work for free. So at the level that we can, we try to operate at best practice. And so we did this fundraiser, we raised money, we applied to government to support this project, and it got the lowest ranking for artistic merit any project had ever received, which made me so proud as a curator. Again, you don't need to be congratulated for your ideas, you need to have ideas that you think about over time. 52 Artists was a project that had sat in the back of my head for 5 years, and when I got to Artspace, I told Michelle, and she got it. And she was like, let's apply, let's do this, let's put it out there. And people came back and said, what is this project? So the project happened every week for a year on Instagram. We created a website, which was an online accumulative archive of the projects as they occurred. Because archives, as we know, have power. How do we actually share information? People come to us all the time and ask, how can I access artists in the Philippines? How can I access artists in New Zealand? As curators, as an organization, we have knowledge of practices because we like art. We see a lot of art, and we want to share that information. So a project like this was a way for us to do a vast amount of research and share that with audiences. We also came aboard a collaboration with Henson Publishing, and they committed to create a book at the end of the project that would become an encyclopedia of artist action. So the project is on Instagram, it's on an accumulative website with in-depth documentation, it's on a publication, so it hasn't even been a show yet. And I think it's really important when you're thinking about curating or institutions or programming that you're thinking not just what is the end game in a space, but what is the process of creating an accumulative audience and capacity for artists over time with a durational project that actually does something unstable. It's saying to artists, we have artists from 32 countries in this show, so we're working, with artists in Pakistan, with artists in the Philippines, and one of the artists from the Philippines we worked with was Pio Abad, with whom we created this tote bag, which is, I've had it with these motherfucking snakes in the motherfucking government. And the first person who comes up to me after this show can take this tote. I'll give it to you as a gift for listening. But Pio did a great project for us looking at the history of the Marcoses and the erasure of histories and was looking at the archive of political slogans that were used to agitate for different forms of language around resistance and forms of pushback to structures and systems of authority and power in the Philippines. And for him to be able to just create the project he wanted to create in that space is really great. And for us, every week was like this massive risk. What was the artist going to do when they took over the Instagram? What was going to happen? And we have decided to do it as an exhibition back at Artspace, and we're doing it in May this year. And we're going to be showing a work by every artist, and we're going to do a symposium to ask the question about what are the implications of Asia, if Asia is, as we describe it, Turkey to Samoa. So it's a really interesting project for an organisation like ours to think about. But then, something else we do, and this will take me back here to MCAD. I'm going to go back up here. is blah, 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 blah. So 2 of our shows in any 2-year cycle have to be solo commissions by Australian artists as mandated by our government funders. And so, you know, for me it's a bit moribund to be having repeat solo exhibitions of Australian artists that just play to Australian audiences. The problem in Australia is that we're a population of 23 million people on a continent the size of North America. We are spread like, you know, thin Vegemite across a piece of toast, and we're clustered around particular centres on the edge of the continent. We're scarcer in the centre, but we do have an incredible history in Australia with the First Nations people representing over 280 unique language groups at the time of colonisation. 80 language groups still exist. We have one of the oldest continuous histories in the world with Aboriginal people. But what we have is we have a problem of distance. We do still suffer at being at a vast distance, at the cost of living, at a small population. The population of Australia is the same as New York State. I think, you know, we're also the size of Seoul, if you include satellite cities, or Karachi without. So if Australia was one city, the number of public spaces, not-for-profits, festivals, biennials, commercial galleries, art fairs, what we support, we would actually be a really fuck-off cultural city. We'd be amazing. Australia's guilt at liking sports and celebrating cricket, which is boring, and football, which is more interesting, would be kind of, you know, renegotiated if we were one city, because we actually produce and support a vast amount of cultural content. It's just that it's really hard to see when it's spread like that. And it's also hard at these distances. So what Australian artists, and I think it's similar for Filipino artists, and this is something I know from coming here, is the really hard thing is that some artists get instrumentalized early because they represent a type of indigenous or a particular type of local identity-based artist who works well in the biennial and commercial market sector for a small amount of time. And after about 15 years, they tend to get dropped because one of everything has shown at every art fair and everyone's looking for the next thing. Or we find that Aboriginal art gets inappropriately instrumentalized as either a form of tokenistic souvenir culture, not recognizing the fact that actually Indigenous artists from both remote and urban centres are living artists working at the forefront of non-objective practice as it relates to a history of representation through time and cultural law, and that has its own powerful forms of agency, and each one of the 280 language groups that existed in Australia pre-colonisation is distinct. So we have a problem where we see that only half a dozen artists in Australia are represented by international galleries. Australian artists don't build audiences outside of Australia early enough. Australian artists get told that being emerging is the hardest part of your career, and it's a lie. The hardest part of being an artist is mid-career. The hardest part, when you're emerging, go hungry. When you're emerging, volunteer. When you're emerging, do whatever it takes. You know, when you're an emerging curator, an emerging writer, an emerging arts administrator or artist, don't be exploited, but be willing to show up and be part of actually putting yourself out there to make shit. And just make stuff. Make good ideas, make bad ideas, make shows in your garage, make shows in your mum's lounge room, make your own blog, make your own exhibitions, make your own space, create your own audiences, become your own community. That's what you do. That's going to get you through. But then you get to mid-career and you've had a show at every one of the half a dozen spaces in your city. You've got kind of a commercial gallery in your local country who wants you to produce a show every year because your blue works are selling really well to collectors. And you're going to, you know, that work is only selling to a local market. By and large, they have the occasional overseas acquisition, but not so often. And so what happens is the local market gets fatigued and then there's nowhere to go. So something that we think about at Artspace is the fact that emerging artists are not the centre of the art world, that ideas emerge at all stages of an artist's practice, that our program must always be intergenerational, as well as being gender parity, as well as culturally and linguistically diverse. You know, it must actually think about the fact that senior artists must be in conversation with emerging artists and vice versa, because for your work to have relevance, it needs to be heard across different contexts. And what we need to do is provide a space in which Australian artists can get exhibitions in international contexts, not because they're Australian, but just because they make good art. And we established a visiting curators program at Artspace with the university. The university wants access to my network, which is advantageous for us. And they support myself and Michelle to invite 4 to 5 curators a year to Australia to execute research. And we invite curators who embrace methodologies and institutions and contexts for art in a range of contexts, from This year we have a curator, Pavel Sai, coming from the Walker. We have Laura Rakovich, who was fired from the Queen's Museum for her protest against her board's complicity with supporting Israel against Palestinian recognition. We have Jay Patha coming from South Africa, who's established an alternative performance platform. We have Jamila Jones, who's an African-American curator curating the next new museum triennial. And we have Woonsuk Seo, who's a curator from SEMA in Seoul, who founded a really important alternative Artspace pool in Korea in the 1990s. They're all coming to engage with our community. Not all of them will work with us, but some of them will. And Joselina came last year to do a residency with us, and we were able to do research with her. And what happens is we bring people into our community and we get them to meet artists, and we ask them to meet artists not just who they think that they'll be interested in, but artists who they can actually have conversations with to see the breadth and diversity of work in our local context. And what we've been able to do over 5 years is support 9 artist commissions with peer institutions internationally for Australian artists to have the presentation of new commissions and works in Performer, in Chisenhale, in ICA London, in Art Sanjay in Seoul, in Kunsthalle Tbilisi in Georgia, upcoming at MCAD in Manila. And we've been able to support a Dhaka Art Summit in Bangladesh. We've been able to partner with peer institutions to work together to raise the funds to support ambitious new works by living artists, to have iteration not just in Australia but in other contexts. And those projects have been things like Angelica Naziti, who is about to represent Australia at the next Venice Biennale. 4 years ago we went to Angelica and we said we want to do a commission with you, and she was at a point in her career, she'd lived away from Australia for 10 years living in France. She had a lot of early success, but she found that it dried up in Australia, so she was forced to move abroad with her partner, who is also an artist. And well, she chose to live abroad, but it would have been unsustainable for her to stay in Australia. And that's a big challenge for you, for those of you who are artists here, or those of you who work with artists, is how can you stay in the Philippines? How can you, we have lives, we have families, we have friends, we have people we love. You know, those things feed into our practice as arts administrators, as curators, as artists. But do we have to choose to leave our home to be able to be viable? Or can we stay and create mechanisms and platforms in which we can be advocates for what we do locally at international levels? And with Angelica, we said we want to do this commission, and she created a 3-part film called Relay League. She looks at dance, migration, and displacement of people. And what was good with this project was with our solo commissions, we partner with a national touring company in Australia to make sure that our shows go to regional galleries. It's very important to us that we reach communities, and you know, the Philippines has a vast number of islands and indigenous communities and a huge range of regional and rural areas that have, to various extents, different kinds of art centres and environments for supporting culture and community. And we work with a touring agency in Australia called Museums and Galleries New South Wales to tour at least one of our exhibitions a year over 2 to 3 years to regional galleries. At the moment we have 3 of our shows on tour, and we're able to reach audiences of about 200,000 people a year in regional and remote areas with commissions of contemporary art. But we try to do that at the same time that we partner with peers abroad to develop work. So with Angelica, we partnered with Art Sanjay in Korea, and we partnered with an organisation called Proto Cinema from Turkey to work with Kunsthalle Tbilisi in Georgia. And Kunsthalle Tbilisi was a really interesting model to think about in terms of MCAD and also the Philippines, which is how do itinerant and alternative models for supporting new work by artists in contexts where there's no government funding, no kind of visible support, and a kind of shape-shifting environment with expanding and contracting private support. How do you manage any level of sustainability or resilience? And so with Angelica, by doing her show in Art Sanjay, what was great was that, you know, Juan de Lassie, the director of Palais de Tokyo, saw the show, and Juan de Lassie was able to invite Angelica to do a solo exhibition at the Palais de Tokyo, which just opened. We created her first monograph for that show, and that monograph helped her to be competitive as an applicant for the Venice Biennale. We're doing a commission at the moment, which I don't actually have in a minute. I just want to show you the other work. I want to show you how commissioning artist work can create change. We did a work with Chisenhale Gallery in London with an artist called Nick Mangan, and it was a work called Ancient Lights, and it was looking at the history of the sun from the Aztecs till now. And he wanted to use solar panels installed on Chisenhale and Artspace to power the artwork so that it wouldn't rely on the power of the institution but would have its own energy source. And my team then had to research solar panels, and we had to find a way to get affordable solar panels installed on Artspace. And through that process, government actually acquired the solar panels at the end of the show, accelerating the capacity for our organisation to achieve a sustainable energy source by up to 14 years. They said that they would never have released the funding in the next decade. So, you know, I think when you work with artists on projects that can create a different kind of space, you can create a different outcome. The last project I'll talk about is, are you over me yet? Or are you good to hear? Like, do you want to hear like two more things? I'm going to talk you. All right, I'm going to talk you through just something that we do that's important at Artspace is publishing. And I know publishing is something that you think about a lot in the Philippines as well, because publishing, having monographs, creating books, writing your own history, having people in your community who are experts, art historians, theorists, but also artists, having oral histories recorded, because quite often in places like Australia and elsewhere in the region, histories were not recorded at the time of their happening. And how do you actually provide the space in order to make sure that the depth of your context is represented, and its diversity and its nuances and its challenged versions of events are captured. There's not one version of events ever in any legitimate history. And what we wanted to do at Artspace was, Artspace always has a rich history of theoretical and critical publishing, but when I started as director, we audited our archive and found over 500 boxes of books that had never been distributed. So what does that mean, right? The books look good, you launch them, you say, well done, but then you put them in a cupboard and no one ever reads them. So what is that? So Michelle and I wanted to take a 3-speed approach, again, to thinking through publishing. What we thought was critical was that we maintain a program of monographic exhibition publishing, because that's how you actually mark a level of accomplishment in the significance of particularly mid-career artists, and how you can support them to advocate for them to audiences outside of a local context. And that is a really important and vital thing to do, and also how you can create space for different histories to be recorded. We wanted to support that there's, you know, a lot of you will know that there's ways of creating publishing, speculative fiction, cli-fi, artists working with text as a form of activism, as social practice, as response. And we wanted to support artists to create expanded fields of leading through different ways of thinking through fiction and also narrative writing. And we wanted to create a book fair, because I love books, my house is filled with books, and I have a rule which is 1 in, 1 out, which is grueling. But, you know, we have to support makers, creators and distributors of alternative and independent publishing to meet each other and meet audiences in order to create capacity for books to be distributed. And Artspace no longer makes books unless we have a publisher attached from the outset. So books don't go into the archive, they go into the world. So what we did was we created a couple of partnerships. We created this partnership with the Biennale of Sydney, where we did a project with Stephanie Rosenthal for her Biennale of Sydney 3 years ago, called the Bureau of Writing, where for 10 months, 7 artists could apply. 7 artists were selected to participate in 10 workshops with visiting international artists and curators to create expanded and speculative forms for artist-led publishing initiatives. We didn't create an outcome for this project at the outset. We said to the artists, we want you to decide what you wanted to do, what you want to do. 2 years previously, Juliana Engberg's Biennale of Sydney had been beleaguered by accusations of conflict of interest, because the Belgian-Nettes family who had founded the Biennale of Sydney had diversified their income revenue streams over the 42 years of the Biennale, to the extent that they were holding the contract to manage Manus and Nauru detention centres, Australia's illegal mandatory detention centres for both people and asylum seekers, which are concentration camps and a breach of human rights. And artists said, we don't want to be beneficiaries of funding from a private foundation that is making $3 billion a year off human torture. And so of the 132 artists in that Biennale of Sydney, 78 chose to boycott, unless the chairman, who was Luca Belgiano-Nettes, the son of the founder, Franco, who had set up Artspace, had resigned from the board. So we have to think, you know, in the 21st century, you know, you live in a complicated context. Pio's pointed it out, a lot of you have pointed it out. Where does money come from? Who's making it? How are they making it? What does that represent? If you are actually generating money through philanthropy, benefaction, and private giving, what does that mean if that doesn't actually align with the ethics and values of the work? And it's happening everywhere, from the Whitney with their biennial at the moment, through to the Tate, through to places like the Biennale of Sydney. It's happening everywhere. So what we wanted to do was, because artists pointed out with Juliana's Biennale that boycott was an effective form of political action, and language was something that was very important. With the Bureau of Writing, with Stephanie's Biennale, which was the next, We wanted to create a space where artists were working in advance of the Biennale with the team, and if there was conflict with Stephanie's edition, that they would be galvanized to be able to shape and speak to the challenges around the recognition of the agencies of artists and conflicts that may exist around institutions and their funding and the kinds of work that they're representing. So it was a really important project. At the end, there was no protests around Stephanie's Biennale, but with this project, our participants chose to do a publication at the end, and they worked with people like Adrian Heathfield and Heeman Chong, who is currently doing a project with MCAD on significant writing, which actually spoke about the discursive space of non-participation as a political act. Another project we did was we worked with the Dhaka Art Summit last year to take 21 Indigenous writers from 4 continents to Bangladesh for 10 days in partnership with the Office for Contemporary Art Norway and the Sandani Art Foundation to speak about new leadership models for Indigenous writers, curators and administrators. And we took 5 Aboriginal artists and curators. There was people from Sami country in Norway, but there was also Chittagong in Bangladesh, Indigenous people from India, from Taiwan, from the Pacific, like I said, from Turtle Island, from Canada. And the Indigenous participants actually sat around the table and led the discussion. We had presentations of 2 to 6 hours a day. Every Indigenous participant presented their own perspective on what leadership looked like from an Indigenous point of view, and new leadership models through institutional and also publishing initiatives. And they could invite those who were seated around them, which was the rest of us, to speak at a time that they felt was appropriate. And so it was a very kind of powerful and charged way to think about how Indigenous voices and First Nations people can lead the discussion about what they want from institutions and how they will lead our institutions. And for me, I say at Artspace, you know, it will be a great day when Artspace has its first Indigenous director. You know, I'm the first woman director in over 18 years, and it will be a really great thing to see an Indigenous director. Something else we did was we created a book fair in partnership with Printed Matter from New York. And we created the first off-site art book fair with Printed Matter. They do the New York Art Book Fair and the LA Art Book Fair. The New York Art Book Fair sees about 33,000 people a year through the doors at PS1. And we wanted, but it's always got this punk, agitprop, alternative, trestle table, tablecloth, kind of fuck you, LGB, punk, rock and roll kind of vibe. It's got the high end of second market storybooks and collectibles, but it also has the kind of ways in which zines and alternative publishing has often created and led an expanded space for alternative artistic communities to find their voice and agitate for a different kind of art world. And so our art book fair brings in, we do it biennially, it's called Volume, and we get about 7,000 to 9,000 people in 3 days. Considering our audience in 2013 was 9,000 people through the doors in 1 year, having an event that sees 9,000 people in 3 days is really exciting for the organisation. And we have been able to increase our audiences by diversifying audiences on site to about 37,000 people a year, which is good for a space like ours. And then with, you know, regional touring, we can hit another 200 to 250,000 people a year, and with international partnerships. So we're able to really agitate for Australian art in different contexts and different ways. That's, you know, we do a project called Book Machine with an organisation called One Star Press from Paris, where over 5 days we have members of the public collaborate in 2 3-hour sessions with emerging graphic designers from art schools in the city to do blind dating to create 100-page artist books with anything you want. And that's a great project. So it's ways of bringing in different communities. I suppose this is, I'll go to this. I'll talk about Basel quickly. Do you want to know about Basel quickly? Why am I working in the beast of the belly of the beast? So 5 years ago, I got a call from Art Basel who said, we'd like to invite you to curate a sector. And as an Australian, I thought what they meant by curate a sector was that they were going to have me maybe curate a video program of Australian artists that would have to be funded by an Australian government funding agency in like the VIP sector or something. And they came back to me and they said, no, we want you to pick up and curate the installation sector that has today been curated by Yuko Hasegawa. And we want you to curate that sector because Magnus Renfrew, who was then director, had seen a biennial I'd co-curated in Australia at the Art Gallery of South Australia, where I had collaborated with architects. And he'd seen a show I'd done at Art Sonje with Kim Sunjung, looking at landscape urbanism. And he saw a show I had worked on in China called No Name Station, which I'd actually worked on with Michelle looking at the history of contact between Indigenous Australia, white Australia and China. And he felt that I had an approach to contemporary art that was thinking about collaborative modes of realising projects at a different level of ambition. At Artspace, quite often we don't actually attribute shows to a singular curator. It may be that an idea comes from myself or someone else on the team. Someone may choose the artists, but how the project is realised is how we curate. How we select the artists for our studio program is how we curate. How we include artists in our ideas platform is how we curate. How we select the publications or book fair, or how we relate to participants and audiences with public programs, with education, with community engagement, is how we curate. It's not just whose name is on the door. It's not just about authorial modes of the curator as auteur and the curator getting congratulated for everything. It's about how an organisation works with a team of people to realise a level of ambition that could not be achieved alone, and how we actually all share and shape in that process. And for Art Basel, these installations occupy, there's 2 levels to Art Basel Hong Kong, and there's 2 corridors that divide the 2 levels. In the early 2000s, a director of Basel was established in the 1960s by gallerists, and it was established to show avant-garde and conceptual art. And this might be a bit boring, but I'm going to get to the good part in a minute. And in the 2000s, they realized that there needed to be a connection between the level of ambition that you see in installation, performance, moving image, outside of the remit of the market in terms of its domestic relationship to the acquisition of objects for collectors' homes or collections. And you had to think about how institutions collect in an expanded way, and how foundations, not-for-profits and museums can engage with the market in collaboration with collectors. And so they created these curated sectors. In Basel, it's called Unlimited, and it has its own hall. And Unlimited has about 130 projects, and at the moment is curated by Gianni Yetzer from the Herschel Museum, and it's a magnificent feast of everything. There's also a public art sector called Parkour, and in Miami it's called Public. In Hong Kong it's called Encounters. And my sector, I have to curate installations that can occupy the 2 meridians of Art Basel, the 4 corridors over the 2 floors. But in Basel, Unlimited has 4 weeks to install because Basel owns the halls. In Miami, Public goes up in 3 weeks because Art Basel, Miami is so important to the economy of Florida that they'll do anything for Basel. In Hong Kong, it's the busiest convention center in the world, and the entire fair goes in 4 days. My sector goes in 24 hours. I have to curate. My installations are up to 100 square meters, so up to 12 meters high, and 10 by 10 square meters on the floor, so 100 square meters of volume. They must amplify a sense of ambition, and they must represent an expanded space of risk in contemporary art. I can't build rooms, I can't block passage, I can't create noise, I can't stop the activity of the fair. So I can't show formal painting, I can't show video. My works have to allow the function of the fair to continue, but my whole sector has to go in this 24-hour period from next Monday, 5 o'clock, till midnight Tuesday night, and foreground this kind of level of excellence and ambition. So what I've done with my sector is I've reduced the number of projects from 30 to 12. And what I try to do is I try to work site-specifically with artists to realise projects at a level of, and to work collaboratively. The galleries pay for everything, which is remarkable. And we need galleries to be supporting artists from the region. I try to make sure that at least half my projects are artists from the region. By reducing the number of projects, I've been able to make sure that I can get more press, marketing and publicity for the projects. I want artists to succeed. I want artists in the market to be showing fuck-off projects that represent unexpected or exciting or historical moments of significance. And I want the market to pick those up and run with them. I don't want the market to tell artists what to make. I want artists to make great work and for the market to expand to create space for great work. But my view is that more is more. The more spaces we have for art, the more audiences we'll have for art. The more people who collect art and the more people who buy art, the more artists will be able to invest back in their practices and have lives that are fulfilling, and they will be able to create social change. They will be able to effect and affect the social, cultural and political vocabulary of what it is we are, and to agitate and push and nudge and shift at the boundaries of what is legitimate. And I think that I love curating encounters. When I was invited, they said it would be 2 years, maximum 3. This is my 5th edition. It's a bit like Gilligan's Island. I am doing a 6th, but 70,000 people come to Art Basel in 5 days. It's the largest audience for a single event at that amount of time. And it's been amazing in that organisation to be a part of the team. The way it works is that galleries submit proposals in October of each year, and I go to Hong Kong and I sit in a room and I get out sticky tape and scissors and I collage the meridians. And architects fly in from the Netherlands, the operations team come in for Basel, and over 5 days I go into the room and I say, here's what I want. And they say, we're going to render it overnight and tell you what you can't do. And the next morning I go back in and they say, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. So then I have to go back and I have to recurate and I have to go forward and they go, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. And I go back and I recurate. And you know what? I think it's a really good thing to learn that people don't always say yes. And you have to be robust. You have to, as your own self, not be tied to your own vanity, but like, this is such a good idea, why don't you support my idea? You have to go, this is my idea, and I'm going to make my idea happen, and I'm going to make it happen this way. And if you won't support it this way, I'll make the idea happen this way, and I'll make the idea happen this way, and then you negotiate with them. And you find ways to get them to do things they never thought they were going to do. But you bring them with you on the journey by sharing. So I work with the team from Art Basel over 5 days intensively, and they say no, and I say but. And they say no, and I say but. And then they say okay, and I'm like, great. And then, I get to do things like water features or getting shamans in to create vortexes to the spirit world or have durational performance works. And, the first year I curated encounters, the thing I was told was we've got to stop people touching the work. And I became a curator for so many reasons, but one of them is because I'm a total klutz and I break everything I touch. And the irony of me working with potentially valuable objects is not lost on my family. And I love to be able to touch art. I like to be able to breach the threshold and context. I love installation because of the way that you move through. I love the Aquilazan's work downstairs because of the way you come up through it. I want to make contact with work. So with encounters, I've really been able to, by reducing the number of projects, increasing the ambition, create ways in which the works can be touched by audiences, to the extent that I was able to achieve things like a floor mosaic by the Chinese artist Wang Wei, which was a 10 by 12 meter floor mosaic where it was installed in the 24 hours, and it was an image that was the enclosure of the monkeys enclosure at the Berlin Zoo. And it was the VIP days, people walked across it like it was a runway down at Central. But on the public days, people had picnics. And the audience, because in Hong Kong, that kind of public space is a space where you sit, it's a space where you meet. When you go into the kind of communities that exist in Quarry Bay, or you go to any parts of the city where the high-rises are, it's on those areas of tiled surface where communities just sit and meet. And something that's important to me with encounters is that they become landmarks for the audience, that they go, I'll meet you at the mosaic, or I'll meet you at the Dead Dictators, which was a work by Shen Xiaomin. And I was in New York 2 weeks before the election where Trump was elected Prime Minister, and I was at a dinner and I said, everyone at the dinner was saying there's no way that Trump will get in. I was like, you're idiots, of course he's going to get in. Like, there's such a, there's a lot of angry white people in the world who feel pissed off because they want bigger cars and pools and longer holidays and better private schools for their kids, and they're angry because people of color and Asians and women and other assholes are like taking their shit and they want it back. And I was like, of course Trump is going to be president. And of course in Australia, the right-wing forces of parties led by people like, Pauline Hanson are going to get renewed power because people are pissed off because they want more. And so it was great. I advocated for this work, and it was 4 dead dictators, including Mao Zedong and Stalin. Fidel Castro actually died not conveniently, 3 days before Art Basel Hong Kong, and he was the one who was on life support for the fair. But it was a great work. I actually had one of the galleries come to me and say, we've heard that you've got some dead dictators in your encounters this year, and we think that it will be bad for Feng Shui. And I actually had a water feature that year, and I had a Feng Shui expert, because one of the things I was told was that I had to get it oriented properly for Feng Shui. And I said, actually, I'll get my Feng Shui expert to look at the dead dictators, and I'll get back to you. So I was able to write back to this mega gallery, one of my most favorite curatorial emails ever, and say, no, I consulted with my Feng Shui expert, it's going to be fine. Dead dictators don't pose any immediate risk. And the last thing I just want to say that I've been able to do in Hong Kong is because I am an Australian curator, and I have lived abroad and I have worked in other contexts, but I do try to work from Australia as much as I can and to advocate to be international and viable from my context. And I have been able to include Australian artists in Art Basel every edition I've curated. This year I'll be including an Aboriginal artist called Tony Albert, but this is Napanyapa Yunupingu. She didn't begin making art until she was 55. She comes from a remote island community called Elko Island. Her family are Yolngu people and her father was an activist for land rights in Australia. Her practice is a vital and vibrant form of contemporary art. I love that she was an older woman artist. She still works in a form of raking, which is cross-hatching and taking the bark from the trees, and it is bark painting, so seen as an anachronistic form but in a very contemporaneous way, reimagined by her. And what's been great in my sector, and one of the reasons that kept me, is that more than half of my works tend to be acquired by museums, and this work was acquired by a museum. So I'm really proud to get works by living artists in different ways through into the market and to work in collaboration, and thank you for listening to me.
Just want to say how lucky all of you are to have listened to Alexie. So we'll be opening the floor for questions, not for long. We'll probably take on 3 questions. Is there any?
How are we going to go about to send Filipino artists in residency?
How are you going to send
Yes.
Filipino artists in residency anywhere
in your
in our space?
in your space?
I mean, if you know a philanthropist who will cover the cost of airfare and per diems, then we will very happily provide accommodation. And
So
we do
the-
partner
So
with.
is the fee or the food?
We think artists. We don't want artists, so we try to partner sometimes. We have collaborative residencies for international artists in Japan at the moment, in Finland, and in. Where they are? Is there another one? That's the only 2. We have previously had them with Taiwan and with Korea as well. And what we do with supported international residencies where we can work with countries where there's no limited government support, is we try to work with peer institutions. So if there was, we actually did talk about, you work with 4A, don't you? Yeah. Are you working on a residency program? No. What we try to do is we try to partner with peer institutions and work also with the private sector to make sure that we can get funds committed for, we try to aim for 3 years because I think things are better when they're done in multiples rather than one-offs, because they create more capacity and more momentum through time and also more familiarity. And what we do is we ask the peer institutions that we work with them to try and secure funds to cover the artist's airfare and accommodation, to cover the artist's airfare and per diems, but we cover the accommodation through our benefaction program.
Would they have an exhibit in your place?
I don't think artists should do exhibitions connected with residencies. I think what you find is when people come from another country, when Australian artists come to the Philippines and do residencies, they're like, oh my God, I want to make work about graffiti and street art, or I want to make work about politics. And they want to tell you something. When artists come to Australia, they invariably want to make work that tells us about the history of colonisation and how bad we are to Aboriginals, and we know that. And actually, Indigenous artists will tell their own story, thank you very much. I think what happens with residencies are when people come, and sometimes you come to a residency and then an artist wants to make buckets of work, and they find themselves inspired to make a huge amount of work. And sometimes artists come on residencies and they just want to go to the beach, and they just want to absorb the environment and connect with other artists and build relationships. And both sets of approaches are actually equally valid, because what they both do is build capacity. And if you're interested in that artist practice, we will often invite them back to do a show or to do a further residency. Because what you do is we get them to meet other institutions, to meet collectors, to meet other peers, and to create networks where perhaps the outcome may or may not be with Artspace. But something that we need to do is advocate for artists to get outcomes not just at Artspace, but in other organizations. So
do you have a panel who chooses artists, and do you have a certain age limit?
No, like I said, we're completely intergenerational. I think we have a residency, who are we doing a residency? We're doing a partnership at the moment with France, and we're doing it for 3 years. We're getting our 2 funding agencies to jointly support us to work with an organisation called Confort Madorn, and we want to support 3 artist residencies over 3 years for artists across generations for 6 weeks in France and 6 weeks in Australia, but with no prescriptive outcome.
Okay, thank you.
questions for you. The first one would be, what is your perspective of contemporary art scene here in the Philippines compared to Australia? It's like, that's very interesting. And the second one, and the second one would be your role in MCAD, in the advisory board. How does that affect the projects and the direction of like what you do in MCAD? So that's
good, big, rich, robust questions. So the first one was how
our work in Australia,
how Australia compares to the Philippines.
It's like
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, I'm just going to think about this for a minute, because I want to answer it properly, and I want to pay respect to the fact that you've asked this legitimately. It's not, Australia is different. Like I said before, we're a population of 23 million people on the largest island in the world, you know, and it is the population, in a sense, of larger Manila. You know, it is a different context. We also have a history of a different we are still part of the empire, we are still a Commonwealth country, and we have a model of governance and politics that is built on a British model. And we also have public funding available at a state and federal level. So we have a different context to you. And something that's been quite important, actually, that I'm going to go back to for a minute, because this actually is really important, is that in Australia, in the 1980s, in the 1970s and 1980s, in every state and territory, not-for-profit and alternative spaces, often led by artists, opened to create infrastructure for exhibitions, publishing, you know, sometimes self-funded, sometimes not. The oldest organisation was an organisation in Adelaide called CAXA, which was established out of a society for contemporary art that was pioneering in the 1930s, all the way through to organisations that were established for experimental media. And I'm the chair of a network called Contemporary Arts Organisations Australia, and that is a self-organised, self-sustaining network of 15 organisations in every state and territory in Australia. We fund ourselves. Organisations under $500,000 a year operating pay $500. Organisations under $1 million pay $1,000, and organisations over $1 million pay $2,000. The money goes into a kitty, and we use that money to pay for the smaller organisations to travel to meetings. And we meet twice a year in different states and territories across Australia to share information and knowledge about the things that are challenging our organisations. Things from governance, board, the inability to pay artist fees, staffing, personnel. And the reason I compare this to the Philippines is that for 15 years, we've supported this network ourselves. And what we have is actually established structures for professional development and networks in Australia that invest in a kind of peer-to-peer collegiality. There is a lot of collegiality that exists in the Philippines, but it is a different context because you don't have the opportunity that our organisations have to get public funding for operations, albeit the fact that the funding we receive is very limited, uncompromised, and increasingly tied to the agenda of government. It used to be that public funding in Australia, there was a separation of church and state. It's now become very much church and state in bed together, which is why we do shows like Public Body, because government now dictates the kind of content we can show with threats that are both passive and overt. But we do have that kind of professional framework that can lend capacity. And what KO does is actually means that you don't feel isolated. And it means that you can say, you know, we're actually paying our staff 30% less than they should be paid against minimum wage. We're actually not paying artists. How can we change the agenda? Or we say we have a board where our director is sleeping with a junior staff member, and that's actually compromising our governance. Or we have a benefactor who's holding our organisation hostage by threatening to remove funding that we've become reliant on if we don't show their collection. You know, these are things that happen. You know, so but what we do is twice a year we get in a room, and it's not Pollyanna. You know, it's not always holding hands and everybody likes each other. But what it means is that we actually speak frankly with each other to say, here's how we dealt with that situation where our chairman slept with a staff member. Here's how we dealt with that benefactor who held us hostage. Here's how we tried to maneuver resources from one part of our program to pay artists at least a basic fee that met standards set by the National Association for the Visual Arts. Here's how we've actually reduced our staff to pay staff more but have increased capacity. And that kind of professional knowledge sharing is invaluable. And the role of the advisory board at MCAD is not to tell the MCAD team how to do their job. It's not to tell them what's in their program. It's not to tell them who to curate or who to think about or what books to make or what shows to do or, how to suck eggs. It's to listen to them and bring a diversity of perspectives to the table, local stakeholders who are a mixture of professional peers and also potential philanthropists, advocates and benefactors, with international peers who can actually say, in our context, here's how we thought about this. Fumio Nanjo is the director of the Mori Art Museum. It's very different than being the director of Artspace. He and I bring different perspectives to the table about what art is in the region and how organizations operate. Paul Pfeiffer brings a different perspective, but then local people like Mercedes Zobel or others, and the brothers at the table, Brother Dodo and others, bring a different perspective. And Chris and Yoselina and the team in this room can come to us and say, we actually are feeling that we're not delivering here. We're not actually understanding how the program can operate effectively in this way. We actually have ambitions to do this, but do you think we actually have the right priority? And as peers who bring different levels of experience and understanding of the sector to bear, what do you think we should be thinking about? How can we think about this in different ways? How can we be resilient? How can we be ever-changing, ever-challenging? How can we not just be like MCAD does this and try to dig in? But how can we be like MCAD wants to do these things? And something that's been achieved by MCAD executive over the past 2 years that I've been on the board, and the advisory board that's existed for 2 years, has been that they've created and ratified a strategic plan. And having an effective strategic plan is a very powerful thing, because the strategic plan is a roadmap. When I gave you our mission and vision, if anything in our program doesn't match that mission and vision, we don't do it. If it's not in my strategic plan, I don't do it. If I can't resource it and pay for it, I don't do it. So we have to work out, Michelle and I, at all times with our board and our staff, what are we capable of doing? And we use our board to feed up and feed down. And so you have to use, any advisory board is only as effective as the skin in the game. And I've got lots of skin in the game, and when I come to the table for MCAD, I care about them succeeding. And I want the Philippines to have a rich, diverse scene. I want Green Papaya, I want Ateneo, I want Bellas Artes. I want everything here to succeed, and I want there to be more here for artists. And I want MCAD to succeed, because what MCAD does is distinct and different in this context than what other people do, and that conversation is the one that's going to create more space for Filipino artists to be seen and to be advocated for.
Thank you.
One last.
Does that sound like it makes sense? Chris, Joselina?
Yeah. One last.
Yes. So I think supporting over time in the Philippines, I would like to see more it would be great to see that capacity for peer-to-peer support become stronger.
Hello.
Hello.
I have questions.
Questions, so many questions. I'm a terrible dancer and I love spicy food.
Okay, so you have chaired the Contemporary Art Organizations Australia.
Yes.
Did this position influence the direction of Artspace for the coming years? Do you think that something similar to the Contemporary Art Organizations Australia would benefit the many artist-run and non-profit art organizations spread over the Philippines to get funding and support from both the public and private sectors?
In Australia, Contemporary Arts Organisations Australia, KO, as we call it, was originally the first 5 years of KO was actually supported by federal government, and the Australia Council for the Arts actually paid for the organisations to meet. And it meant that organisations that had very little money and were operating in isolation could have the capacity to come together. And it was through a visionary sum of money that was applied by a kind of very important, a woman called Anna Waldman, who was a director of visual arts at the Australia Council, who believed that the not-for-profit sector and independent and alternative Kunsthalle spaces were like the engine room of the art world. and that they were being neglected and not supported, and that there was a lot more competition between them rather than collaboration, and that if government actually invested some money in building relationships between these organisations at vast geographical distances, that she would create and support and encourage a level of collegiality which hadn't previously existed. And that happened for 5 years, and then the network decided to self-fund and created the resources to contribute to support the organisations. And I think in the Philippines, it's very tricky without having somebody who's prepared to step up at the beginning to invest, to create a space where people can come to the table as equals. But you can do it. And I think that in the I think being collegiate is really important. And I think, you know, it's very hard, it's very easy to get into a trench warfare when you're working in a sector as under-resourced as the visual arts, particularly at the end of contemporary art. And to think that anything you have and anything someone else has is at the expense of you having it, you know? And I think it takes quite a shift in mindset over time to understand that actually, if somebody else is succeeding, it's not at your expense, it's to your benefit. Because the more people succeed, the more diversity, the more breadth, the more complication there is in the context, the more richness there is, the more opportunity there is. And it's hard. Like in Australia, we had funding cuts 4 years ago. Our government, after the Biennale of Sydney protest, which I mentioned to you, our Federal Minister for the Arts said that any public organisation that rejected private funding on ethical grounds would be defunded. And he removed, the Australia Council for the Art used to have $28 million to support not-for-profits across dance, theatre, the visual arts, literature in Australia. Overnight, without warning, he removed 45% of the funding, which meant that 56 organisations in Australia in the visual arts who received operational funding, within 12 months, 28 of them lost their funding and are no longer funded at a state level. And of the KO organisations, of the 15, there was 5 of them who lost their funding. 2 of them have closed down, and it was up to the network to invest in supporting those artists at a peer-to-peer level. So I do think that we're operating in a climate where there is, in a sense, less resource in Australia and more necessity to diversify and to be competitive. But at the same time, there's more necessity to be ethical and to be generous and to be willing to believe that the more people succeed, it's not at your expense. It's to everyone's benefit. And I think that for me, the way that being the chair of KO now for 5 years, or 4 years I've been chair, the way it's changed Artspace has been that I've actually done things for KO with Michelle, she's public officer. We've created a website that actually works. We've created an archive of the 15 years of the network's history. We've invested in communication and supporting and ratifying certain principles around how we support the smaller organisations. And that leadership, and when the money was removed, we launched a campaign called Art Matters. And we said, some of us, we received our funding, some of us got our funding, but you know what, for those people who didn't, this is bullshit. And what government is doing is wrong. And the kind of conflict and tension and binary politics that belongs in the 20th century, not the 21st, is not going to drag us down. And we created a statement in 1 week that had 48 signatures from almost every state and territory museum, as well as philanthropists. Arts leaders in Australia came together to sign a letter of support to say that the 5 organisations who were defunded as a consequence of the minister, his name is Minister Brandis, taking this money as a reprisal for artists boycotting on ethical grounds, this was wrong. The money didn't come back, but it sent a message that we are not going to be at each other's throats, and that we are going to care about the ecology as much as we care for ourselves, and that we have a responsibility to our people and to our community to do that. So I think it's about leadership. And for Artspace, being part of KO is about being a good citizen and showing leadership that can actually provide a space for new generations to come through and lead effectively. Because at the end of the day, we don't own this, we just care for it. We're custodians and we hand it on. Joselina won't be at MCAD forever, I won't be at Artspace forever. These organisations are not us. We hand them on to the next generation and they will do what they do, and they will make it better or worse, but that is up to them. What we can do is provide the best foundation for our artistic communities to be advocated for.
With that, thank you so much, Alexie, and thank you so much for coming. I hope that was useful and